Bleach 1000 Year Blood War episode 35 Don't Chase a Shadow adapts just under 5 chapters worth of manga material, making it the episode with the most amount of manga chapters in Core 3. This latest episode adapts material from the midpoint of chapter 644 until just before the end of chapter 649. Last week's episode similarly focused on material from the manga as we had the first half of Mairi vs Pernida adapted, and this week we see the first half of Shunsui's battle against Lille Barrow. The episode begins with content from chapter 645 where Shunsui showcases his Shikai, with the first half of the episode adapting up to the end of chapter 646 where Lille activates his holy form called the Divine Judgment. The second half sees Shunsui activating his Bankai along with some new dialogue which is exchanged between Ichigo and Askin. Episode 35 remains very faithful to the manga, but there are one or two omissions that have been made, so be sure to stick around until the very end of the video to find out what has been cut from this week's episode. We do have a lot to talk about, so let's dive into the manga versus anime analysis of the latest episode of Bleach. Lastly, I'm going to refrain from talking about scenes which are one-to-one adaptations from the manga, and we'll be solely focusing on what has been cut, changed and added to the anime. We got really tired of the same old boring anime shirts, so we decided to launch Gutsuga.com with the aim of creating designs inspired by our favorite anime and manga. We came up with designs that look cool and represent all of our favorite stories. Check out the latest Instinct collection, which features some amazing designs like this Frosted Heavens design inspired by Toshiro Hitsugaya, or this Instinct design inspired by Hollow Ichigo, and my personal favorite, which is the Heart design, which was inspired by Ukiura Shifa. Do not miss out, go to Getsuga.com and wear your favorite stories. So the episode begins with a bit of a recap of what had happened last week, but in addition to this, we do have the first 3 pages of chapter 640 adapted here. Now the dialogue is not adapted, but we do see Mairi's Bankai exploding from the inside out, as this suggests that the battle against Pernida is not just over yet. We then have some anime original reactions from Byakuya, Rukia, Soifon and Yushiro, as we then cut to content from the midpoint of chapter 644. Now from this chapter there are 3 panels of dialogue which are cut from the anime here, and this is where Urahara asks everyone if all of the lieutenants have been taken out. Renji says that he, Rukia and Momo are still here, and Shunsui confirms that Nanao is still with him. So none of these 3 panels make it into the anime. After Shunsui uses his Shikai ability and appears behind Lille Barrow, as the episode adapts all the way up until the very end of chapter 644. Following the opening song, the episode begins by adapting the first 10 pages of chapter 645. So this is mostly Shunsui telling Nanao to get to safety as she refuses to leave him, as they then talk about the specifics of Shunsui's Shikai, with Shunsui then formally introducing himself as the Captain Commander of the Gotei 13. Following this, the first 4 pages of chapter 646 are then adapted. This is where Nanao relays to the other Shinigami to move on ahead without Shunsui. We then cut back to the second half of chapter 645 as the rest of the chapter is adapted, all the way up until the point where Shunsui says that once a child has grabbed your hand, as Shunsui speaks about how when a child grabs your hand, it's already all over, you're stuck playing until death, as he tells Lille that his hand has already been taken, as he offers to continue playing until their death. Following this, the rest of chapter 646 is adapted from page 5 to 17. This is where Lille restores his Reishi weapon, which was just cut by Shunsui, as Shunsui plays another children's game involving shadows, as he ends up impaling Lille from behind. This leads to Lille opening both of his eyes for the 3rd time in this fight, as Lille then awakens his holy form called Divine Judgment. He then fires these 3 blinding flashes of light towards Shunsui, which gravely injure him, and this takes us to the midpoint of the episode, with the first half having adapted all the way up until the end of chapter 646. We do have 2 mid-cards for this week's episode. The first is about Shunsui, as it explains that he is the current Captain Commander of the Gotei 13, and he was formerly the captain of the 8th Division. The second mid-card is about Lille Barrow, as it explains that his shrift is X for the X-axis. This allows him the power to pierce through everything which is along the line of his sight. He of course was the first Quincy which was bestowed a power by Yhwach, and he is referred to as the greatest masterpiece amongst the Sternritter. He also describes himself to be the closest man to God. Following this, we begin the second half of the episode as we adapt the first 7 pages of chapter 647. This is all the way up until the point where Shunsui uses Haro 78 Zangarin. Now following this, we do have a few pages which are cut or rearranged from the manga. This is pages 7 to 13, and this is where Gerard appears in front of the Shinigami, as Shinji states that they have finally arrived within the enemy stronghold, as he tells Rukia and Renji to get their game faces on, but then suddenly they are confronted by Gerard, as Gerard is making it out as though the Shinigami had bumped into him, rather than he had come flying towards them. So Gerard says that if they wish to go any further, then they'll have to get past him, as Renji immediately strikes. Shinji tells Renji that he'll leave Gerard to him as he continues on forward, but Gerard spreads his cape out wide, preventing Shinji from moving any further. Gerard explains how a miracle may occur on a one-on-one fight, but they still won't be able to beat him, as he tells them all to come at him all at once. Now I do wonder how this scene is going to be adapted into the anime, especially considering Renji got an anime exclusive scene where it appears as though he has been completely taken out by Uryu. So I do think that these few pages from chapter 647, which were not adapted into this episode, are definitely going to be reworked somehow. Now following this, we get an exchange between Ichigo and Askin, and this actually adapts content from pages 1 to 3 of chapter 648, but all of the dialogue is completely changed. So you could say that this is an anime original scene because of how much reworking has been done. So Askin is pushed back after a brief clash with Ichigo, as he says that this is why he didn't want to fight him. We then get even more new dialogue with Askin questioning if Ichigo spent some time at the royal palace. He asks if he had received any weird training or if he had learnt new techniques from Ichibe. Ichigo dismisses his questioning, but this confirms Askin's suspicions, stating that this explains why Ichigo is not experiencing reishi poisoning right now. Askin says that there is nothing to worry about because all that he needs to do is to adjust the flavor in order to make Ichigo susceptible to his poisoning. Now this again is totally different to their dialogue and their encounter at the beginning of chapter 648, as it's mostly Ichigo bumping into Askin as he says that you're that guy from earlier, asking what had happened to Grimmjow. He explains that Grimmjow is just sleeping over there, as Ichigo wonders whether if Grimmjow had lost. Askin refuses to tell Ichigo what happened to Grimmjow, as he instead introduces himself as Ichigo charges towards him. So yeah, it's understandable as to why this has been reworked, since a couple of episodes ago we did see Grimmjow, since the anime reworked this already, since we saw Ichigo appear in front of Askin right after he had beaten Grimmjow. So Ichigo had already known what had happened to the Arrancar. Now following this, we cut back to the end of chapter 647 as we have Shunsui's Bankai activation adapted, and this leads us perfectly into page 3 of chapter 648, where Ichigo reacts to the sudden spiritual pressure release of Shunsui. Now we do have one page from the manga which is cut here, and this is where Ganju, Chad and Orihime exchange some dialogue as they react to Shunsui's Bankai. Ganju wonders why it's gotten dark and cold all of a sudden, but Chad corrects him, stating that the temperature hasn't dropped and it hasn't gotten darker either. Chad just explains that he is feeling the chills. Orihime also adds that she doesn't see or hear anything, but she cannot stop trembling. So instead of getting all of this, we do get to see everybody on the battlefield react to Shunsui's Bankai, which replaces this page from the manga. As then we cut to manga content with Ichigo saying, "Is this the spiritual pressure of Shunsui?" Following this, the remainder of chapter 648 is adapted. This is up until the point where Shunsui activates the third act of his Bankai. Now this takes us to chapter 649, as the fourth and final act of Shunsui's Bankai is adapted, with episode 35 ending on page 15 of chapter 649. So there is a bit more left of the chapter which they'll adapt in a couple of episodes, I think, because it's revealed that next week we are going to be cutting back to Mayuri's battle against Pernida, with episode 36 being confirmed to be titled Baby Hold Your Hand 2. And at the very end of the episode we had a poem which was read by a young Nemu. So for the most part this episode was very faithful to the manga. They did rework that Ichigo and Askin dialogue, which I am glad about, but there were two notable omissions. The content involving Gerard from chapter 647, and then that page of Ganju, Chad and Orihime reacting to Shunsui's Bankai. Now these cuts were made alongside the rearranging of content, because in the manga, Basby vs Hashward was actually the first fight during this portion of the story. Then following that we had Mayuri vs Pernida, and then Shunsui vs Lille. Now the order of the fights in the manga actually showed all of these fights until their completion, and then we got to see the next one, but the anime is rearranging things so that it appears as though all of these fights are happening at the same time. So we're going to get the second half of Mayuri vs Pernida. I think the episode after that will be the second half of Shunsui vs Lille, and then the final 2 to 3 episodes of Core 3 will be adapting Basby vs Hashward. So I am definitely looking forward to that. But for now, do let me know all of your thoughts about episode 35 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime. Were you happy with how Shunsui's Bankai was depicted in this episode? Did you enjoy seeing Lille Barrow's holy form? What are your thoughts about the cut content that didn't make it in this week's episode? And are you excited to see the finale of Mayuri vs Pernida next week? If there's anything that I've forgotten to mention, then do continue the discussion in the comments. And lastly, thanks for making it to the end of the video, and I cannot wait to see you next week for my breakdown and analysis of episode 36 of the all-new Bleach 1000-Year Blood War arc anime. A massive thank you goes out to all of my amazing Patreon supporters for helping to make this video possible. If you also want to support the channel and see your name in the end of my videos, then check out my Patreon, which has loads of perks like early video access and so much more. Thank you for sticking around till the end of the video, and whatever you contribute will mean a lot to me.